right, it's the top of the hour. We've got folks joining from South Africa, Portland, of course, and Fiona, you're in Berlin, yes? My name is Chad Whitacre. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA, and I am head of open source at Sentry, which is an application monitoring company. Earlier this week, we announced our annual open source funding program, in which we distributed $500,000 to over 500 maintainers through 2 platforms. That's the blog post here on the screen share. Through 2 platforms, GitHub sponsors, and thanks dev. Our program focuses on both breadth and depth. We aim to give at least a little bit to all of our dependencies, along with projects that our employees suggest. And we give larger amounts to certain projects based on their importance to our business. One accomplishment we're particularly proud of this year is that we became the first company by a long shot to approach 100% coverage of all of our sponsorable dependencies on GitHub. That's this screenshot. Yeah, so our session today is the future of open source, the state of sustainability. And joining me are 2 other leaders in open source funding. Kara Sowles Deloss is a senior open source program manager at GitHub, where she created GitHub's Maintainer Month, organized the GitHub Maintainer Summit, and led the inaugural cohort of a funding program called the GitHub Accelerator. Welcome, Kara.
Hey, really good to be here.
Hey. And we also have Fiona Krakenbürger, aka Fiona Octopus Citizen, I guess is the literal translation, aka Fiona Krakenbürger, if you're a confused transcription AI. Who has been working in open source funding for almost 10 years, most recently as co-founder of the Sovereign Tech Fund, which is funded by the German government. So thank you for joining us, Fiona.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi to everyone.
Welcome aboard. All right, so let's warm this up. Kara, I'll hand it back to you. Tell us a little bit about the GitHub Accelerator. Give us kind of your elevator pitch for us. And in particular, tell us how much money did you distribute and to how many projects?
Yeah, so this is GitHub's first time doing something like this. So it's kind of an experiment, as most things should be. We started off with doing 20 projects, $20,000 per project, and we worked with them for over the course of 10 weeks. So that was kind of our 20-20-10 ratio there. With the GitHub Accelerator, our focus really was open source projects, finding paths to sustainability, and us helping guide figuring out what the right path is. So it was a lot of conversations with other open source maintainers and organizations, figuring out how do you make money long-term in open source so that your project can continue and you can continue to keep a roof over your head working in open source. And our approach to it was really there's not one size fits all. Let's buckle down and do the work together to figure out what's right for each project.
Cool, thank you. Fiona, let's hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit about the Sovereign Tech Fund, and in particular, what your budget was this past year and how many projects you worked with.
Sure, happy to. So the Sovereign Tech Fund is a program that was initiated and co-created by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and us, in the beginning, pretty small group of people that have been working in open source for a long time, and who thought it's time to create a new funding vehicle to support specifically open source infrastructure and the maintenance of open source. We've been working in different open source funding programs before, and we saw that there was a strong need to support the existing technologies out there. So this is what we focus on, open source infrastructure, that is all the underlying core technologies that we use to create software, libraries, developer tools, programming languages, the infrastructure that is needed for programming languages, package managers, also the work on protocols and the implementations. Yeah, this is what we do. We are investing in these. So we provide contracts for maintainers and people working on these technologies We are now 1 year old. We started last year. We launched roughly, I think, a year ago and probably a week. So we're still pretty young. It's also a very novel approach using public funding for supporting open source technology. So this is a very special approach that we chose. Yeah, and I think we counted the numbers for the anniversary last week, and we invested a total of 15.25 million from the German ministry, from our budget, and invested them into 40 technology projects. So same projects, because those are different technologies, and we're supporting, the technologies we're supporting with us are probably many more, but those are the projects and the contracts we provided with our different funding mechanisms.
So Fiona, that's definitely a wow. 11, what would you say? Say the number again. How many million?
In 1 year, I was actually a bit surprised myself,
Yeah.
but it's a total of 15.25 million.
15
and there
million.
are, yeah.
I think the website only says 11 million. I've been telling everybody they gave 11 million, but it's 15 million.
Well, we started last year with a pilot round, and then this year we got additional funding. We also have funding for next year, and we are tied to federal funds. But yeah, it's it's, in a way, it's a lot of money, but in a way it's also not, right? So we definitely have way more requests coming in. We have an open application platform, we scout. So yeah, we're really happy because this is a pretty significant and serious commitment also by the German government that we would like to see copied elsewhere. But there's a lot of work to do.
How hard was it to convince the German government to do this?
So I kind of think
it's like the government. It's like the German government, right? It's like, what do you say? The Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Change. So I guess this falls.
Climate action, yeah. So you know how you think that 1 year for a dog counts like 7 years? You have to kind of reverse that. So for getting funding for a public for a project. So I think the work on Sovereign Tech Fund, we launched last year, but our work on that started a couple of years ago. I think the first meetings happened in 2020. So wow. 3 years. It took us 3 years until we could finally get, or actually 2.5 years. And that's lightning speed. So that's really, really fast. So divided by 7 kind of. Because, and I think it was just a really good time window of opportunity. So there were a couple of things happening. We're very fortunate in finding the right people in the government who understood why what we wanted to do is important. We did. My co-founder Adriana Groh and we worked at the Prototype Fund before. So we've done public funding and open source before. I worked at the Open Technology Fund, which by the way was heavily under siege back then. So there was an actual threat that the OTF would be shut down or the funding would be frozen. And it became pretty clear and very apparent in a pretty shocking way that there's not enough redundancy in the field and we needed more support for open source technologies. So a couple of things came together. Then this A team of people that have been working in different capacities in open source funding with public money. And that definitely helped. But yeah, it took us a while. We wrote a feasibility. First, we wrote a concept, then we wrote a feasibility study. And then by talking to the right people and also some experience and knowing how to suggest concepts like these and what needs to fall into place, we've been able to secure that funding. But yeah, it was a lot of work. It was a lot of conversations, but compared to other programs, I think we've been really fast.
Now, the flip side of that is, and you said you already have secured funding for next year. Hopefully the commitment is not just a flash in the pan. I mean, does it feel like this is something that's going to be pretty stable long-term?
So eventually it's federal money. So I think all those that have been working with public funding before know about the sort of limitations that come with it. There are going to be budget negotiations by the federal government. So until then, you don't have 100% guarantee, but there's a strong commitment by the German government to provide us with additional funding next year and also in the upcoming years. But it's something that we, when we started last year, it became pretty clear to us, we have to show really fast what the heck we mean with open source funding, open source infrastructure funding, and make it really clear and tangible to people how this is linked to, hey, you want innovation, you kind of have to look at the resources and the basis of that. You want security, okay, well, this is what you need to take care of. So I guess the magic and the sort of the also the disadvantage of open source infrastructure when you're trying to tell the story is, it's the basis of everything. So let's try to find out how we can tell the story to make it clear that this is really, really important. And one thing that I would want to mention that definitely helped in creating the needed urgency and sense of urgency in the government is we published the feasibility study in 2021, just in time, of course, for the elections and the coalition negotiations. So, the timing was good. And then 2 weeks after we published the feasibility study, Log4j happened.
Oh, wow.
We have nothing to do with that. But for better or worse, I think it really created the sense of, making people understand why what we are doing is important and how paramount it is. I often say that everything that happened after Log4j actually should have happened after Heartbleed, because I think that was the first wake-up call. But yeah, I think it kind of helped to create that sense of urgency and help people understand what we're talking about.
Okay, great. Lots of stuff in there that we'll come back to. I do want to switch over to the GitHub Accelerator, Kara, and dig in a little more and have you help us understand it. So the word accelerator is an interesting one. Because oftentimes we hear accelerator. I mean, the first place my mind goes is like a startup accelerator.
Yeah.
Right. So clearly you chose that word for a reason. Unpack a little more for us. Who are the folks coming in? Tell us a little more about them. And you were talking about this path to sustainability. How do you think about that in relation to this idea of an accelerator, and particularly startup accelerators?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's something you think of in the startup space. But a lot of open source projects are left out of that model because there's an expectation with a startup accelerator that you're going for a certain growth curve. And that growth curve is not, doesn't even matter if it's possible. It's not desirable for a lot of open source projects, that like hockey stick curve. So we had a lot of conversations with folks about like, hey, as you figure out what your funding model is going to be, when you look at where you take money from, what are the expectations behind that? And for a lot of them, the traditional like startup expectations of getting funding in that, VC and angel investing and stuff, it's not actually, it doesn't match what they want from the project, and it doesn't match what's healthy for the project. So with Accelerator, we tried to, with that experimental mindset, right, accept a really wide variety of projects. So we had ones that were going for VC funding. We had ones that got VC funding during it. We definitely pursue that with some folks, but we tried to give a wide berth. And I think that's what sets it apart from a traditional accelerator.
I was going to ask if you had any that actually, so you're telling me you did have. Can you give us some examples? Let's get into some specific. Is terrific.
Yeah. So specifically, the one that I can't tell you about because they haven't announced.
Okay, that's fair.
So it was, but we had people on different, different spaces in the pathway, right? So we had people who were actively seeking funding while they were an accelerator, and I think one of the mistakes I made is that we should have talked about like, is VC funding right for you right at the start? Because you have VCs going down the list and saying, GitHub's taking a bet on these projects. Maybe I should take a bet on them too. And like having good education around like, is this something you want or not? Because it's hard when someone walks up with potentially a bunch of money.
Is there one project that's top of mind that you want to share with us as like a success story from the accelerator? Like they came in, they were confused, and after 10 weeks, they were less confused or something. Like how did you think about success with the program? And what would be an example of that?
Yeah, in terms of success, because we had such a broad array of projects, success looked like a lot of different things. And I'll name projects in a minute, but without naming projects, it looked like things as varied as projects looking at their current model and looking at their team and saying, you know what, we actually don't want to invest in this project anymore. Some of us
Oh,
want to
wow.
move on. For some, it was like, hey, we realize that this can't be sustainable. And I
Okay.
think that's just as valuable as the majority of the projects, which looked at and said, I can see a pathway, because in both cases, we want what's best for the project and what's best for the maintainer. So we tried to really dig in and have the hard conversations that said, like, is this, what's right for you folks?
Mhm.
I think a fun example is Simon Willison's project, Dataset, was in the
Oh, yeah.
accelerator. And Simon has been very interested in different models that fit, like, what energy he has to chat with projects without, like, what does it look like to not have really long-term, like, people are pinging you for support all the time, but
Okay.
you're able to help them, and how do you balance that? So so he was looking a lot. I would love to see someone do a model, which he kept bringing up, where, like, what does it look like where someone can call you into their company and say, I want to talk to you for 2 hours, and that's it. You're an expert on this. I use your tool. Let's chat and end it there.
Mhm.
And the contrast with looking at building it out as a SaaS, so we brought folks in to look at what that looks like for him.
Mhm.
But what he's actually doing right now is he's got as he builds that out, he's got a sponsor that, instead of sending him money directly, said, hey, we will pay for someone to work on Dataset. We'll, like, pay a contractor, tell us who you want. He had someone who was already working on it, who was a fantastic fit. And then that sponsor is paying that contractor to work on the project, which is a huge help. And it also shows how there's a lot of different ways for companies to support projects. And
Mhm.
it's not always just, like, giving a handful of cash
So
right up.
then so the company paying for the contractor,
Mhm.
what's their motivation? What are they getting out of it?
Yeah. So I think actually, that's a really good question.
Did they get 2 hours of Simon's time or whatever that you were talking about earlier, like the consulting thing, or?
They don't. They're investing in the project and the success of the
Okay,
project. Mhm.
great.
Yeah,
Okay, so it really is just a sponsorship.
exactly. It's just
Particular
a slightly
shape.
different model of sponsorship. So
Yeah.
kind of trying to get creative with that. I would say also, in terms of support, like, a lot of the lessons that I came out of this with, in terms of what resources aren't available to maintainers, like, I went in thinking, like, oh, they don't have enough co-maintainers, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough time.
Mm.
Maintainers don't have enough legal resources
Mm.
and like financial accounting resources and things like that can be very specific in open source.
Yeah.
And like contracts and stuff like that, when you start taking customers, those kinds of things. And that's the kind of thing that, like, yeah, a traditional startup program will help build that stuff in.
Right.
How do we build that stuff for open source folks who don't have access to those resources?
Yeah, I love it. That's definitely, I was going to say that's, the huge value of the accelerator is all of that extra stuff in addition to the cash, but then also the network too, right? I mean, you had these folks, and you, if I remember right, you were doing weekly calls or whatever, right? You're sort of like building a little, like we all think about how powerful the alumni networks of these, like the big, incubators and accelerators are. Presumably that's part of what you're doing here too, what you were doing with the accelerator.
Absolutely. And it was interesting, like, when we talked to folks afterwards, it was kind of split. Like, half the folks were like, oh, the most valuable thing was the money, and half the folks was like, well, the most valuable thing was meeting on a regular basis with people who've made it work and having those conversations.
Very cool. So let's go back to this idea of motivations. Okay, motivations for funding. Because we talked here about, like, the data set example, and this company is giving and they're supporting the project because presumably they're depending on the project. Fiona, you've got a really broad, you're talking about digital infrastructure, and I almost wanted to ask, like, what doesn't count as digital infrastructure? You're listing, there's so many things. How do you both think about this question of motivation and what motivates funders to give and what should motivate, and kind of maybe where some of the gaps are in what's possible right now? Do you think, and any thoughts that come top of mind on that, the question of motivations and funding, and why different actors would?
I can start. So one thing that I would like to emphasize, as we also have this overarching title around sustainability, and I've been thinking around like how, from what angle we are looking at it as SDF, sustainability and open source funding. We got this question in the beginning a little bit. People were trying to wrap their heads around the fact that we are public investors, investing in tools that are getting a lot of investments, like actually are used by so many companies. Like one of the projects in our pilot round was Curl. You can definitely argue there's a lot of companies, almost probably every company that has software in any kind of way, is using Curl. And they've been trying to understand, but why would a public funder now go in there when we actually want companies to pay their fair share, whatever that means? And we consistently say, it's not about either or. We need more actors in the field from the private and from the public, because I think public and private actors offer different kinds of sustainability and long-term engagement, or they can offer different formats. Everyone brings something else to the table, maybe foundations or a public funder or companies. So I want to put this out there up front, that I think we need more actors and not less or one or the other. Our take on motivation now, looking again at the reason why we think there should be public engagement, one way how we frame our investments is we invest in open source ecosystem with a public interest in mind. So we want to establish firmly that a secure, a robust, a well-functioning open source ecosystem with enough resources contributes is in the public interest, because it provides security, it provides technical alternatives, it provides the technical diversity that we need for free and open access to all the tools that are built on top. It's a common a digital commons that we are all using, so we need to invest because we want to establish the understanding that digital infrastructure is no different than physical infrastructure. And my co-founder Adriana Groh, she's very good at creating political narratives, because she's been doing this for a long time. And she always says, and I think that pins it down really neatly, one of these days, we don't want to talk about how much the German government, whether the German government should support open source infrastructure, but just with how much. Because it's so clear to everyone, just like agriculture or education, we don't talk and discuss, hey, we really should invest into education. We just talk about how much. That's the discussion we should be having. We have this very German word that's impossible to translate. If someone has an idea, let me know, of digitale Daseinsvorsorge. So Daseinsvorsorge is a concept in the German language, but also in our, I would say, even state theory, sort of the public interest services that a government is responsible for. It's in the realm of the government. They should take care of it. And we see open source infrastructure as part of that.
So have you had any projects apply that you've turned away because they don't fit that criterion of digital public infrastructure, public digital infrastructure?
Yeah, so this is one of the criteria that we have when we look at technologies. I mean, I can't disclose necessarily which projects we turned away because people apply, but it has to be, so there are different ways to look at it. For example, is there already a ton of industry funding available? I would say, okay, I can maybe give an example about a sort of ecosystem. So when we get an application for an AI product, I would say there's tons of resources available out there. A product doesn't serve, like when you're working on a product or more on the application level, that might be helpful for people, but it's not serving a public interest. So we think the sort of open source infrastructure technologies we're supporting, they serve so many different needs, and they're like an openly available resource where there's a public interest that these are well maintained. So, for example, open protocol implementations compared to that create more technical diversity. One of the projects we supported in the pilot round was OpenBGPD, which is an alternative to other BGP protocols, super important for networking. And there was in the past years a lack of technical diversity. There were just one or two open implementations. So it was important to really invest into this other open implementation to create technical diversity and more robust, actually networking environment.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to bring in to the screen share here. This is a plug for FOSS Funders, which is a group that Sentry is a part of. The goal with this group is to make it weird for corporate actors. We're talking about the different actors in the ecosystem. For companies, make it weird for companies not to give to open source. What I want to, so just briefly, like we're trying to collect logos of companies that intentionally fund open source and link out to where they tell their story about how they fund. But I bring it up because I want to offer this model here for thinking, because what I'm hearing you say is like, the way I've got it set up here is end user applications, developer productivity tools, operating systems. Is it fair to say that when you talk about digital infrastructure, you're really talking about levels of the stack? You're talking about closer to the operating systems and developer productivity. When you get up into end user applications, that would not, you're talking about products. Is this a way to think about what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to not use the OSI model because people have strong opinions about that. But
what do you mean by that? The OSI model?
Sorry, so the different layers of what technology. At the top is the application layer, because lots of things we support technically are also in the application layer. So let's just forget what I said the past 20 seconds. So yes, that's correct. End user applications is a better way to frame it. At this point, we don't support these, not saying that in the future we might also open our focus a bit. But at the moment, we really focus on the things that are underlying, because I don't know if we're going to talk about challenges that we see in the field, but I still do think pushing for the understanding of open source infrastructure is quite the big task, because usually when we talk to folks about open source, they do think about the application. That's still, I think, the overall understanding, unfortunately, of what, I've heard about maybe Linux, I've heard about open office, but the fact that we have the strata, this layer surrounding all what technology is, which is underlying open source technologies, which I know the GitHub Accelerator and also Sentry is also investing in. I think there's still a story to tell, and we need to really get better and make sure that people understand open source is everywhere. So let's treat it that way. So that's why we're focused now.
Kara, how did it play out in the accelerator? You said you had projects at all different levels, from commercial to non-commercial and different needs. Did you also have the diversity at these levels that we're talking about here with applications and operating systems and everything in between?
Not as much as we probably should have. Actually, this is making me really think about that as we approach it next time around. In terms of everyone using open source, I think the last State of Open report is estimated 90% of companies use open source. And you're right, I think they're just like, folks are not aware that they're basing so much on it. I also really like this governmental model because there's so much uncertainty to the corporate funding model. Like we have some companies like Sentry that are actually putting their money where their mouth is. And like at GitHub, open source is in our blood, right? It's like, it's our platform. We see it every day. We get it. But we've seen not to be a bummer, but like in the past year with, budget cuts and stuff across the industry, we've seen a pullback on support of open source, with a lot of OSPOs getting trimmed or cut altogether. OSPOs are open source program offices. And OSPOs are in a lot of companies, I mean, they're an essential layer to translating money at the company to open source in practice. And with that pullback on OSPOs, I think it's temporary, very temporary. But it shows that like corporate funding is capricious, and we need something much more stable.
So I'm going to bring this into the screen share.
Definitely seen this. Just as a comment on that, we've actually in some of at least in one of the projects we're supporting, we've actually moved in because a commercial funder pulled out. And I've seen this a lot, and we're talking about huge amounts. And yeah, it's a bit concerning to see that. I think it's going to have pretty strong effects on the field. I hope it's not going to last very long.
I just noticed the other day in the GNU Manifesto, from 1984, 5, when was it written? 83, somewhere in there. All sorts of development can be funded with a software tax. Like, is this what we're going back to? I don't think, Fiona, with with the funding that you've got from the ministry there, it's not tied to a specific tax like is being proposed here, is it?
No, it is taxpayers' money.
Right.
But yeah, it's not a dedicated tax. And I'm gonna hold back for a second, but I definitely have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if
see.
I should speak to my opinions on taxation, but
Let's
I'm gonna
mix it up. I don't know.
we're gonna skip that.
If you want to, you can. I
Yeah.
actually thoughts to share too, but
Yeah, I mean, to put it in the big grand scheme of things, we have a thing called taxation already, and I really want companies to pay taxes to begin with. And in a way, the fact that the Sovereign Tech Fund is getting money from a ministry that has elected officials in there that determine the strategy and sign off on these discussions, that's a democratic process. And so, we have tax money allocated to these things. So I would love to see actually more of that. Public taxpayers' money being invested in open source infrastructure because it's considered an important part of what a public what's part of public services. Not saying that I don't think it's interesting to think about this as some additional model. Maybe there's a dedicated organization that does this, but I'm just careful of meddling this, like elevating this too much on a state level, because we already have a system called taxes, and I'd rather see that being allocated to the right things. But I also think the model that we actually are already seeing in a couple of consortia or associations, that there are members who are paying a specific fee, could be seen as a tax that is then redistributed to the important open source components.
So I'll bring this in, which is relevant, I think, to that last comment, Governing the Commons by Eleanor Ostrom. If I know some folks in here will be familiar with this, some may not. But this is a book from, I think, 92, maybe 1990, where she talks about the tragedy of the commons and how to overcome it. And to kind of oversimplify it and boil it down, it sort of describes like how to set up sort of like quasi-governmental structures. So we've got government and taxation. We have, like you're saying, a system that already exists, and let's use that system. But then we're also saying, it's probably good to, bring in a phrase here, pool our variability, right? Like have different actors, have different models, so that if one thing fails, it's a more resilient system if we have multiple approaches in play. And that's, to come back to this, like I really, my view is that, like, here, let me offer this. I think there's 3 different approaches to open source sustainability, and I think the 3 of us kind of represent these 3 approaches, with the progress we're doing, okay? So I think on the one end, yes, we have a taxation system. Let's use that, Fiona, that's what you're doing with STF. I think on the other hand, we've got lots of examples of how to commercialize an open source project. So a lot of the folks you've been working with, Kara, are pursuing that. It sounds like some are even pretty far along with that, right? And my own employer, so I work for Sentry, which started life as an open source side project in 2008, and started taking venture capital years later, and is now employing 350 people, and we all we think of ourselves as an open source company. So there's sort of like that other extreme, which is, let's call it market, okay? Commercializing a project. And then I think there's this really interesting place in the middle, which, and I don't have exactly the right words for it yet, but it's something around, like, it has to do with this idea of the commons. It has to do with what we're trying to do at Sentry with our giving program is, I think, here, let me offer this. We always talk about ROI, and earlier, Fiona, you were talking about, like, well, you have to go back and make the case, for the impact that the funding had, right? What's the return on the investment, or the money we're putting into this? The way that we think about our program at Sentry is actually flipped. I think about it as IOR instead of ROI. Okay, so Sentry's built on open source software. And for the past year, because we run our program annually, for the past year, we've gotten value out of these open source projects. And so what I'm doing, that we just announced 2 days ago, is giving money reciprocally for the value that we've already received. So it's not so like it kind of Kara, what you were saying, I think in the chat, like the money that you give to the projects in the accelerator is no strings attached. That's how we think of it. The 500 grand that we just gave away, that we're giving away over the course of this next year. It's no strings attached. It's like I'm giving you like money for the value that you already gave me in the open source projects. So that I think is an interesting intermediate between these two. It's like that there's this space for projects which aren't commercializing but are somehow receiving sponsorships, and if there's enough companies that voluntarily give money on this basis kind of reciprocally, that opens up a pretty interesting space kind of in between there. All right, let me get off my soapbox. That's
look at this patchwork that we're talking about, right? Like a little money here, a little money there. You get some from Sentry, you get some from an accelerator, you get some from the government. Like the way that we ask open source projects to navigate this like kind of endless maze of trying to piece together who's giving money right now and who's not, and how do you even get in touch, or do you get grants, or where do you go to? Like that in itself, I think, is really inaccessible to a lot of projects where, they're just trying to keep on top of their like 1,000 issues that they're behind, let alone like figure out who's handing out, cash right now. And I think that's really hard.
I think there's a difference too between what I would call active and passive. I think the projects that you worked with would fall in that active category because obviously they came to you, right? But I think Fiona, in one of our earlier conversations before this call, I think you used the phrase push and pull, that some projects come to you to apply, just like some projects come to the accelerator, like the projects come to the accelerator are active in that regard. But then you also work with some projects that you approach, right? That you identify as being important digital infrastructure. What's kind of the split? I think you said you had 40, 50 projects you were working with. What's kind of the split there? And can you give an example of one of those? I guess it'd be the push, right? Where you reached out to a project and said, we think you need some money to do your work better.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know. I would say it's probably 50-50. I personally think that that it's good practice to have, like, I understand it's not always possible, but if possible, it's, I think, good to have both a push and a pull mechanism, because some will never apply because they might never hear about you. They might not have the capacities to apply for whatever reason, but you reach out to them because you identify them as critical technologies. But on the other hand, I will never have the full view of what's out there and what's important. So it's good to have, in addition, an application platform where people can apply that I've never heard about, that I don't discover. So you can imagine that those are very specific conversations when we actually reach out to people and we say, I know about your project. I've seen it in a criticality list. I know that it's important not only for companies, but also maybe for administration, because it's such a core. There's actually a pretty good list of critical technologies published by the EU Parliament, with a list of 30 technologies that are used in the Parliament. I can dig it up later. I think it's, oh no, I think it was a commission that published it. They have a good open source program office. We identify those and we get in touch with them. And sometimes people turn us down. They say, I don't really want to get money for this. This seems like, you learn a lot along these conversations, because not everyone wants to turn a night job into a day job. It might be something that they want to work on in their free time. And that's totally fair, because if you give people money, you make them work more on this, and it becomes a very different thing. As I think Kara said before, it's really important to cater to the diversity of people in the field. They might not even need money. Maybe we can come up with another support mechanism next year, or the kind of money they need is really small. Maybe they just need 5,000 to organize a little retreat for all the contributors. And we didn't provide contracts less than 150K. So that excludes a lot, which was
your smallest Your smallest contract is 150K?
I think it's actually less. We made some exceptions, but we just started, and for capacity reasons, we knew we can't provide a ton of contracts. We did develop different funding mechanisms, but in the beginning it was really that we said not less than 150K because we can't provide 100 contracts in our first year. So let's try to create different sizes, and we started at 100. I think the smallest is something like 80K. But yeah, so we do have these conversations. Sorry, getting back on track. What I wanted to say. And it's very interesting to talk to folks and see, like, what does money mean to you if you don't apply and you don't ask for it. One interesting project that we are supporting is Yocto. It helps you to build, to create a Linux image on embedded devices. It's virtually in every kind of IoT device that you can imagine. It's heavily used in industry. And it was an interesting conversation because they do have support from industry. They've been very successful in fundraising, but there are components that it's really hard to get money for and to include in a 5-year roadmap, such as maintenance. So, when you create roadmaps, it's really hard to include those tasks and to get buy-in for things that are not feature development. My colleague Tara often jokes, we might be the only funder who pays people to remove code, but it's important, right? Because things like code smell, I think it's called these days, they exist. And this really, the work on the code base, removing things that might be outdated, they're just creating issues, and deprecating things and features, that's really important work. And sometimes that's an interesting component of what public interest might be for a project that does get some industry funding, has been successful in fundraising, but there might be additional activities and work packages or something else where it's hard to get funding for. And that's where we come into play, and we can support or give a complementary kind of support. But yeah, we also get really amazing projects that apply. But yeah, it's a pretty good mix, I would say. And I really appreciate that we get to do this. I wasn't entirely sure if we'd be able to experiment with these two approaches, but so far it's been working, and we get a lot of freedom to experiment also from the ministry because they understand it's new, sort of have to figure out how this works. And yeah, we base our scouting on research. So there's a lot of research already out there with criticality scores and lists. There's also things that are coming up because, of recent developments. But then having this additional application platform, I think, is a great addition and complements our scouting work.
I imagine that most of your grants were to folks that applied, and that it was the minority that were ones that you reached out to. Is that fair?
No, it's pretty 50-50.
Okay.
I do know we recently counted the applications, and I think it was for a total of 95 million. So that was an interesting number to look at. Not all of them were in scope, so to say, but all of them were projects that we thought were not all of them were not interesting for us, but there were various considerations that we had to make in our criteria to not go through with all of them. Also, we have a limited budget available, but as I said before, 50 million is a lot, but it's also kind of not. So I think there's a big need out there.
Cool. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left. Let's go to the chat. There's been a lot of great chat. Thank you, everybody, for engaging. Let's bring some of these conversations kind of into the room here. Kara, I see you and Patrick going back and forth about foundations. Let's bring this out. What about foundations to provide, because we're talking about services beyond funding that folks need, legal services, accounting services, and Patrick Mason makes the point. Patrick, previous, what was your role? Director of the OSI, of which was not the layer cake Fiona OSI, but the open source initiative. Makes the point that there's foundations, software foundations that can provide these services. Kara, was this on your radar with the accelerator? Did you have any projects that kind of went that route, or were foundations part of the conversations you had?
Yeah, we did not have projects for the most part that were really interested in foundations, which was interesting. I think foundations are essential. I think they're part of the backbone of open source and what makes it possible as a movement in the first place. I think they provide really essential support and resources, and that this is a place for projects to get resources. But I think it's a personal decision for projects if they actually want to be part of a foundation, and whether that's appealing to them. And a lot of projects just don't feel that that's a fit they want to pursue.
It's kind of the same with the VCs, right? It's like, is
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very
So I
good.
was looking, you mentioned earlier TideLift survey. I think one of the really important things out of the TideLift maintainer survey is, in terms of putting numbers to things, is 13% of the people maintaining an open source project support themselves on their work. And 60% of maintainers see themselves as unpaid hobbyists. So in terms of the push and pull, even in terms of people signing up and saying, I want to join a foundation, I want to jump in here, like these are passion projects for a lot of folks. And I think we have a cultural issue on open source maintainers understanding that they deserve money in the first place. The open source ethos, it's essential to that ethos that this software is free. But we don't talk about that even though it's free, people are putting so much time in that they really need to be paid. And I think we need to balance the way we talk about open source. I talked to someone the other day, it was like, well, everyone's voting against me. Like corporations don't like me because I'm open source. Open source people don't think I should be making money. Like I'm kind of stuck in the middle here.
Yeah, at the same time, people are free to decide that they don't want money for their project.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, for those that feel, I think what you're putting your finger on is that slice of folks who like, yeah, don't realize that it is okay if you do want to ask, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot to overcome. Even people who applied to Accelerator and got in, we would have to have a talk and be like, you need to ask for money to people. Like you're not asking people for money. Like it's hard to do.
Yeah, I would love to know if with the conversation that you had with folks, Kara, I hear this from maintainers that we are working with. They know companies are using their stuff, but they just don't, like, it's hard to find a landing space for them to even know who to talk to. Sometimes you talk to the developers and they know, yeah, sure, we use your stuff, it's really important, but then it really doesn't trespass management. And it never comes to like a support, or they have very disappointed conversations with people like, oh, so you're saying you're doing this for free and we use your stuff and you'd rather have us not use it for free? Well, we're not going to do that. So they have very like difficult conversations there. And they actually asked, and we continuously ask people for their needs to try to react to that. And they said, can you tell us how to talk to companies? Because I think it's hard also to advertise yourself. You then veer a little bit into marketing. How does that work? I don't know. I'm a developer. So I think it's quite a tough nut to figure out how do we create these how do we facilitate these conversations with the sort of convening with the I guess it's sometimes privileged position that we have, being able to talk to many different sides.
Are you aware of the lemonade stand repo?
Yes.
For this.
Yeah. Is that not one of Natia's?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I was looking at that the other day too.
Yeah, let's share this out if folks aren't aware of it.
Find it.
This is a laundry list. This is just like it's kind of like an awesome repo, but it's not using that brand. But yeah, the lemonade stand. Here's a bunch of different ways to find financial support for open source. So the whole range from nonprofit to commercial, from to foundations to, you can see everything in here. If you haven't seen it, check it out. A lot of different models available to folks in here.
It's really good. It's a little older, so I think I've been thinking about putting in some PRs and stuff. I think there's a bunch of stuff has moved forward in the space.
I actually just emailed her yesterday because I was like, don't you want another maintainer on this? So yeah, let's jump on it, Kara. Maybe the three of us, we can, because she's kind of moved on from this
Yeah,
topic.
exactly. Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
Yep. Okay, I'm gonna go to some more questions here. Let's see. I've got one that says, let's see, this is Matt Wayne asking if Sentry giving away money to open source projects puts us at a disadvantage versus other companies who don't give their money away to open source and spend it more selfishly. So binary answer, no. And the reason is we actually, so here's what I want to say about the, let me go back here. These models, we've got the kind of taxation model, we've got the commercialization or nonprofit, the kind of lemonades, maybe lemonade stand is not the right word for it, but yeah, the sort of like active model. In here in the middle, where we're trying to build this, kind of movement of companies like us that kind of get it and give back. Like there are benefits to us, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. It's not purely altruistic. It's not, the benefits are basically social validation, goodwill. A lot of developers who work at Sentry chose us because of our reputation in the open source community. So it helps us with recruiting. It helps us. The other thing too is like we're a developer tools company. We sell to developers. So having that reputational benefit of giving a lot of money to open source projects definitely helps us kind of in those soft ways. So that balances out. Like, do we track that, dollar for dollar? No, but it's something that we're committed to strategically as a company because we are, we see ourselves as part of the open source community and part of the developer community. But it is like that's what we're trying to do here with FOSS Funders is like provide a little more social validation. Because like there was something the other day, the front end masters, on Twitter, I was talking to Mark, his last name Grabansky, maybe, CEO of Front End Masters, and he was saying like he saw that we were giving money, and he was like, "Well, we give money." He's like, "But we don't get anything out of it." And I was like, "Well, you could, it's like, tell your story." I think it's an opportunity for companies to tell a story, and that has value for the companies, but then for the open source community because we build up this kind of movement together, and that's what the governing the commons thing is talking about. Is like, how do you kind of self-organize to police yourselves? Kind of, again, my term would be quasi-governmentally. So I think there's opportunity there. I don't know, Kara, Fiona, if you want to jump in on that one, that was more Sentry specific. Let's see. Here's one for STF. Talking about EU, how does STF relate to Horizon Europe? Is there any connection? Are those competing grants? This is from Martin. Any comments on Horizon Europe?
So our connection is definitely working with NLNet, and they're really amazing fund. I think they also receive money from the Horizon fund, and they hand it out to open source infrastructure too. And I think their folks have been doing pretty amazing work at laying the foundations. And oftentimes when I come across a really important open source project or someone applies, I realize, oh, they've received support from NLNet before. So they're doing really good work. I think they've been one of the first funders who really handed out actual money for software development, or I think it's mostly software development, that displayed and made it pretty clear, demonstrated a very, very thorough technical understanding of the field. So I really marvel at what they're doing, and we were pretty well in touch. Generally speaking, it really doesn't hurt to have more funders in the space. Because, for example, we're not providing grants, we're providing contracts. So for some people, grants might work better, and for others, also circling back a bit to what someone said earlier about punishing people with rewards, and absolutely there are cases where money can actually be harmful. I've seen things where funders provided a lot of money for one open source project, and it's after, I think it was such a huge amount, and they created such a bloated code base with so many features that eventually the community dropped off because they couldn't catch up with things anymore. Because especially volunteer contributors, they have to be on top of things. They have to understand how this thing works. So I think we've seen cases where money wasn't the answer, and shockingly, it's not always the answer. I do think it's an important part of the solution, but talking about sustainability, it's so of paramount importance that whatever we create, we make sure that there's a diversity of offers in the field, either by us or by getting more actors in the field, or understanding and listening really carefully to what people actually need. Maybe it's money, maybe it's a small grant, maybe it's a big investment, maybe it's actually support for how to manage a community, maybe it's legal consultancy. So I think that's definitely an expectation that I have for all of us, that we make sure that our funding models and support mechanism match what the different things that people really need, and that can be incredibly different. I'm very excited about, I think Seth Larson is also in the chat, who's now I think is a maintainer in residence, but I know that there's a program by, I think, the Linux Foundation, which I think is really cool. There's sometimes a person doesn't need money for a specific project. The person just needs money to work on different projects and to get the kind of funding and the payment to go that step and say, okay, I'm going to quit the other job, which is an incredible decision to make, and work on this thing. It's also something that we are thinking about, a model, maintain on residence model, and to test it and to pilot it, because I think, why not elevate it to the state level and say, as German government, you actually should hire 100 public officials who work on open source infrastructure. It's a crazy idea, but why not? And give them unlimited contracts to work on these different things. So unrestricted contracts for a long time, and make them actual public officials, because it's what they do. They work on public services. So I love toying around with that idea. And I think sometimes it's really not project funding what people need, but people funding, because infrastructure in the end, it's a lot of people that we need to support.
Yes. Speaking of people, Kara, there's a question: is unpaid hobbyist is a pejorative term?
Not in the least. I think it's wonderful. Like, unpaid hobbyists are what we've built open source around is fantastic. And so, like, that's when we look, like, when I chat with someone about making their project sustainable, as I said, there's two parts to it. It's like, what do you want for this project? And then what do you want for your own lifestyle? And it has to, like, you have to talk about both of those. Avoiding that is how anyway, you get the wrong model, you get maintainer burnout, you get all that kind of stuff. So I think it's so wonderful and legitimate for people to be like, no, I'm an unpaid hobbyist. I just want to do this in my free time. And that's why we need to be able to send resources like contributors to work on stuff, or like, paying for like hosting and stuff like that. Like, how do we help support projects where they're like, I don't need money?
All right. Feels like we're bringing this in for landing. We got a couple more minutes on the clock. Thank you again, everybody, for joining. Thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry, we have more questions than time to talk about them. So let's pick this up on Mastodon or Twitter or wherever we are these days. Fiona, Kara, any last shout outs you want to give, plugs you want to give, places to continue the conversation, things you want to highlight, final words?
Yeah.
All right.
Go ahead.
So you want to start? I have to think about good final words.
Well, good, because mine will be kind of half-baked. So for GitHub Accelerator, we've got a site. Chad threw it in the chat, but you can just Google GitHub Accelerator and it pops right up. So if you check there, we will have updates that will go there. I can't say yet what the updates will be, but I would keep an eye on that. And you're welcome to reach out to me anytime. I'm not hard to find. I'll throw my email literally in chat. Kara Sowles at github.com. I'm always curious to hear how people are thinking about this, and if there's kind of ways for us to partner.
Maintainers. We love all the maintainers. You want to hear from all the maintainers.
I really do.
Yes. Cool. Kara, thank you. Fiona.
Wait. Oh, I did something weird. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for the conversation. It's been fun. I think it's good to have these exchanges, and because we just need more folks. We should exchange our ideas and approaches, and make sure that we are well coordinated, because I think it's one thing to pour money to the space. I think it's another to be well coordinated on that. I think it's a good service to the field if we sort of internalize, we deal with that complexity of many different funders in the field, and we can make it more clear to people what we can offer. Sure, I would recommend to sign up to our newsletter at Sovereign Tech Fund. We are currently doing some restructuring to gear up for next year. You can learn all about the projects we're supporting that might be interesting, the challenges, the contribute back challenges we just launched and announced the winners. I just posted my Mastodon link here. You can reach me. Happy to chat anytime. And also, if you have anything that you want to talk about, any interest in the Sovereign Tech Fund model, or a good English translation for digitale Daseinsvorsorge, keep it coming. And thank you so much for the conversation and the invitation.
Yeah, I
Great.
want to say thank you to Sentry. Like, you folks have been very exemplary in the space in terms of funding open source. I love seeing you talk about it publicly. And I think there's so much that companies can learn from your model. And I hope that people really take note and follow in your footsteps.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll tell you, it's a lot of fun. It's one of the most fun parts of my job for sure. And I just want more people to share in the fun of, open source, from unpaid hobbyist all the way up to all the other options we have. So Fiona, Kara, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone who joined here, thank you. Thanks for all the engagement. And let's keep it going elsewhere. Okay. Thank you,
Bye,
Thank you, everyone.
everybody. Cheers. Bye.